Good morning. My name is Kira Loughran, and I'm the Associate Producer for the Forum. Before we get started, I would like to take a moment to acknowledge the original caretakers of this land, the Huron-Wendat, the Haudenosaunee, and the Anishinaabe. Welcome this morning. Today's event is the second in a series of events that we've presented with CBC Radio Ideas. They've presented us with a series of challenges in response to our season theme of After the Victory. And what better way to look at that than through the eyes of history as we are today. It's a great pleasure to have such an amazing panel of guests. We've got Margaret and Bob and Karin. I'll let Paul do further introductions, but it's a great opportunity to look at the cyclical nature of history so that we can, particularly in a classical theater, so we can reflect on how these classical plays continue to inform us about our world today and be resonant and relevant in the issues that are happening on the front pages of our newspapers. It's a pleasure to introduce Paul Kennedy, who will be moderating and guiding you through today's activities in the round. And thank you so much for coming, and I hope you enjoy the event.
Thank you, Kira. It's always great to come to Stratford, but today is a really sort of special day for me for a number of reasons. Yes, we're in the round, which poses all kinds of interesting problems and also opportunities. We're also on radio, and nobody knows we're in the round on radio because we're always in the round on radio. This is a special day for me because, believe it or not, once upon a time I dreamed about being an actor when I was a young man and foolish. And so this is a bit like coming home. The second thing, and this I guess is, I'll give my creds here, I actually studied academically, my background is in history. I have a BA and an M Lit in history. I got my master's degree from the University of Edinburgh, and I started studying history at the University of Toronto, which is when I learned I did not want to be an academic. And that has saved a lot of young people a lot of boring classes, I'll tell you that. Other than that, let me just give a little bit of introduction to the shape of the morning. Each of the panelists will deliver a short presentation, perhaps 5 to 7 minutes long, after which I will begin the question period by lobbing out probably one or two general questions for all to answer. There are also ushers in the house who will be collecting pieces of paper if you'd like to submit questions that will be asked. There won't be a microphone going around the house. Those questions will be given to me on a piece of paper, and if it's anything like former forum presentations, I will perhaps get to read aloud 2%. So don't feel hard done by if your question doesn't get asked, and especially given the nature of the panel we have today, I'm sure that there will be lots of talking as well as lots to talk about. I think we should jump right into it. The first speaker today was last year's Massey lecturer. She works in Oxford now in England, where it's St. Anthony's College. She formerly came from Ryerson and the University of Toronto, and she is an amazing speaker. If any of you heard last year's Massey lectures, you'd know that. Please welcome Margaret MacMillan.
Thank you. Thank you, Paul. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, it is a great pleasure to be here. And of course, I'm doing what I like best, coming to a lovely place like Stratford, going to wonderful plays, and then talking about the subject I like best, which is history. Often when I tell people I teach history, they say, that must be so easy then, because once you've got your lecture notes, you never have to change them. Good. You see what I mean. And I say, no, it's more complicated than that. And the past keeps changing because we ask different questions of the past. We have different interests in the present, and we look back to the past to try and understand how we got here. And so when I was at the University of Toronto as a young student, there was nothing called women's history, because women's history wasn't something that people did, because there wasn't really, at that point, a women's movement. And then things changed in the 1960s and 1970s, and suddenly women's history became and remains an important subject. Aboriginal history, when I was first a student in Canada, was not a subject in its own right. And again, that has changed, and that, I think, reflects changes in our own society and concerns that we have. And so history does change. I think myself think it's very important to understand it. I want to understand my own history. We're all products of our own histories. What has happened to us in our lives has made us who we are. When I was walking in here just now, I ran into a wonderful woman who had been my babysitter when I was 3 years old. She looks pretty good. I won't say the same for myself. She's survived the experience in great form. But it was wonderful to be reminded of that past and that part of my history. Groups are also shaped by their history, and we tell ourselves stories about ourselves. That's part of what makes us who we are. We have narratives. How did we get to be who we are? Canadians have stories about themselves. We tend to tell ourselves stories that we're nice, kindly, gentle people who've never hurt a fly. And we know there's another side to that history, and we rightly should be looking at it. We need to look at our relationships with the Aboriginal peoples. We need to look at the things we've done for good and for bad in the past, because that has helped us and made us who we are. History, I think, helps with understanding also, because if we want to understand any of the great conflicts, issues, troubles in the world, we need to know something about the past. How can we understand what is happening in the Middle East today if we don't know something of the troubled history of that world? Because people in the Middle East are seeing each other through the lens of history. They are remembering their own stories, and they're remembering other stories about other people. We can't understand why Russia is behaving as it behaves today unless we understand something of Russian history, and why the Russians have this deep sense of humiliation and a sense that they are a nation that has to be reckoned with. That's very much part of what is going on today. History, unfortunately, can lead to more than understanding. It can lead to great evil. And it is a very powerful force. This is why when people say, oh, it's all there in the past, it's dead, it's buried, that's so wrong. History is like a current that runs through our lives, and history can be used by the unscrupulous, by demagogues, by nationalists of various sorts to tell us stories about others, to tell us stories about our own victimization. You think of the role that history played in the breakup of the former Yugoslavia, where Croats and Serbs who had lived, and Bosnians, Muslims who had lived side by side, often in the same villages, began to kill each other because of stories that were being told them. And so I think we have to understand and reckon with the power of history and the danger of history. But let me end on a more optimistic note. History also, I think, can be used for reconciliation. I think if we try and understand ourselves, our own histories, if we try and understand the histories of others, if we try and understand the viewpoints of others, we have some hope of coming together, some hope of reconciliation, which is why I think you get truth and reconciliation commissions. I think there's a realization among many people that if we don't explore the past, it could fester there under the surface, and we need to get it out. And I think the role of historians, in a way, is a very irritating one. We are like those people that we all dread at dinners when someone's telling a really good story. I was on the bus, this amazing thing happened, and the historian will stop and say, no, you couldn't have been on that bus on that day because it doesn't run. So bear with us. We're irritating, we're pernickety, but I do think we play a useful role in making history do the right thing and not the wrong thing. Thank you.
Thank you, Margaret, for being so irritating and finicky. And keep doing it, if you will, please. The next speaker is an old friend of mine, and I shouldn't use the word old, but I guess a long-term friend of mine. I can't even remember when we first met, but it was many, many years ago. And I have the sad displeasure of reporting that Karin will not be with the CBC much longer. She's decided to move on and live the rest of her life. But Karin Wells has been a long-standing person at the CBC. I think I met her when she was auditioning for a host's role in arts. She has, however, done just about everything else. I know that her travels have taken her as a documentary maker, and she is one of the finest documentary makers this country's ever made. Documentaries, by the way, are a little bit like history. You go and assemble information and facts and put them together. Karin's gone to 50 countries or more in the world to make documentaries about history in the making. And today she's going to give us, I guess, the worm's eye view of what it's like to be talking about history and the challenges.
Thank you. Thank you, Paul, very much. And I must echo what Margaret said, what a wonderful place this is, and how much it makes you think and cogitate upon all these issues. Worm's eye view, indeed. I want to talk about people who history happens to, if you like, who have been the cannon fodder throughout history, who obviously all have stories to tell and who all want to learn from history, which first they have to know. They have to know their own history in one form or the other. And that's been one of the important roles of Truth and Reconciliation Commissions, I believe. We've tended to focus on the reconciliation portion. The truth portion, and it's always a dangerous word, is equally important because it puts out there a record of events that people can agree upon. It states you can no longer deny that these things went on. People to whom history happened. George Saremba. George Saremba, on December the 3rd, 1980, was a student at Makerere University in Kampala. The country at the time was between dictators. Idi Amin had been summarily deposed and had gone to live the good life in Saudi Arabia. And they were had an interim government. Milton Obote, the first president, was looking as though he was going to take over, and he subsequently did. On that night, his intelligence, his military intelligence force came and got George Saremba, got him out of his university residence. He was staying at a place called Patrice Lumumba Hall. And after a while, the names and things like this become kind of redolent. They took him to the Blue Nile Hotel, the 5th floor, and they tortured him all night. Because they felt he was power to the people. It was the time. And at the end of the torture, they obviously didn't get quite what they wanted, and they said, well, we will kill him. And they took him out to the forest east of Kampala, stood him up in the forest, allowed him to make a final statement to whom nobody quite knows, and they shot him. They shot him many times, and they hit him 7 times. Then they threw a grenade at him, and the smoke was such that nobody troubled to see if he was dead. And they went away. Well, he wasn't dead. The rain fell that night, and the water stopped the bleeding. He crawled to the road. This was the beginning, the first day of the new Obote regime. There was a curfew. There were no cars on the road. There was a kid coming by on a bike who, it's a nation of families who know each other quietly here and there. Kid comes by, 12-year-old, sees his body on the side of the road. Oh, that's George. Goes back, gets his father, who comes, bravery beyond belief, with a pickup truck, picks him up. Wasn't safe to take him to any of the hospitals because you didn't know what side the doctors were on. And they took him to Auntie Gladys. Auntie Gladys nursed him till the wounds were healed sufficiently. They got him out to Kenya, and ultimately he came to Canada as a refugee. And at that point, once he became a refugee, he was a person to whom history happened, who now had learned from history and who was making his own, because he knew, if I stay there, I'll be killed. It's the same as every Syrian refugee who decides to live. The man next door and his family were just blown to smithereens last week. I'm out of here. And I've now made my own history. I am moving on, which is what happened to George. He came here, he wrote a play, it was called Come Good Rain, and it chronicled what had happened to him. And I mean, journalists are very useful for this, telling people what's going on in places. There weren't many in Uganda at that point. I think everybody had enough of Uganda with Idi Amin, so it wasn't much reported on. It eventually was. George was supposed to be the first of 300,000 people who were killed under the second Obote regime. But he survived. He went on to get a PhD from Trinity in Dublin and was teaching at Case Western Reserve. Then you look at the rest of the family, because IMF policies came in Uganda. One branch of the family runs this brand new Shell station on the Kabalagala Road out towards Entebbe. Another, the uncle with the pickup truck, started a brewery, and he's doing very well now. Auntie Gladys, who really is the heroine of the story, if you like, Auntie Gladys died of HIV/AIDS. And that, too, of course, is part of the history of Uganda. Milton Obote was summarily deposed eventually, slipped across and took sanctuary, was given sanctuary in Tanzania, and died in Zambia. At that time, most dictators could get away with murder. No one was holding them to account. And that is one of the things that started to happen in terms of regarding accountability and responsibility and learning from history and saying, people really want to know that something has happened to these people. So you get things like the International Criminal Tribunal on the former Yugoslavia set up in The Hague, which tried Milosevic and many others, which downloaded one section of the tribunal to Sarajevo. And in Sarajevo is a woman named Bakira Hasecic. She had started a combination of a support group and a vigilante group of the women who were raped in the war in Bosnia, of whom they were many. And by now, rape had been declared a crime against humanity. It was a weapon of war, not just boys will be boys anymore. So Bakira set this up, and she was interested in going after people who were on the War Crimes Tribunal's A list of suspects. They would be told, you know, so-and-so is living over here, because what you were saying, people were sort of living next door to each other and nobody was dealing with any of that. And this wasn't helping any of the lessons from history. So Bakira and her women, 4 of them that day, off we went to Visegrad, where she lived. And Visegrad was a lovely place where history had been used in a very wily and nasty way. There's a bridge that goes over the River Drina, the subject of a Nobel Prize-winning novel, The Bridge Over the River Drina, clever title. But it had been built when the Ottoman Empire stretched that far, and legend has it, history has it, that when the Ottomans built that bridge, they walled up in one of the great footings 2 Christians, which gave you wonderful ammunition to excite people. You want to kill those Bosnians, you want to kill those Muslims, you Serbian Orthodox Christians. And so that got everybody going. The events in Visegrad were particularly horrendous. And that day, Bakira took a photograph of where she was told this man lived. And she was about to take it down to the court and say, get him. Here, I've got evidence. It was, of course, totally useless as evidence because the way the law works, it was just not sufficient evidence. Ultimately, Milan Lukic, the man who raped her, was indicted. He was arrested in Brazil, never indicted on the rape charges. Bakira held his feet to the fire, held the international community's feet to the fire, and said this should be added to the charges. And wasn't, because by then the tribunal was winding down and everybody'd run out of money and energy and we were tired of doing this and they could never quite finish the job. So you've got that kind of stuff happening. There was another court in Sierra Leone where they just tried, I think, 21 of those most responsible from 3 sides, so it didn't have that feeling of victor's justice. And it was a lovely example of the bad people learning from history. Because there was a fairly good standard of education and there were democratic elections. And one of the hallmarks of that conflict was amputations. And there was a young man sitting in the front row behind the bulletproof glass that is always there in these courthouses. And he only had one hand and hi, Jabate, what happened? One of those nuisancey journalist questions that if you ask them someplace, the answer begins in the year 1200. But if you ask it in Sierra Leone, it doesn't. What happened to him was that his arm was amputated. They said, we will cut off your right hand and then you cannot write. We will cut off your right hand and then you cannot vote. So, very crude, but very effective and made the point. Jabate had also started the Sierra Leonean one-legged football team, which was amazing, And you sort of say, Jabate, you have 2 legs, you only have 1 hand. Yes, I am the goalkeeper. And, it worked. I mean, people laughed. It was good. Anyway, all of which is to say that folks on the ground, people to whom history happens, want to learn from what has happened, want to learn from their own history, want to put events on the table and call upon others to help them do something about it. One last thing, I heard a BBC piece the other morning from Syria, a group of people in what must have been a hospital, and one of the things they were protecting was the library. And you could literally hear bombs going off all round. And they said, yes, we are reading from the library a book that describes how Japan reconstructed itself after the Second World War, and we feel we can learn some things from this after our war is finished. Was quite astounded, and then another man said, yes, and I'm reading Hamlet even while I am doing operations, which was a little unnerving. Anyway, thank you.
Thanks, Karin. I think you talked about 3 people in 3 countries, but mentioned at least 6 or 7 other countries, and you could have gone on longer and longer. But thank you very much for that worm's eye view. Last but not least today is somebody who I think could be said to have made history. Bob Rae was, many of you will remember, Premier of Ontario. After that, he went on to be the interim leader of the Federal Liberal Party. He was talking in the green room just earlier about the possibility of retiring, and he seemed to deny that there is any possibility of doing that, which I think is a very good idea. And I'm the host of Ideas, so I approve completely. Bob Rae.
Thank you very much. We're going to be spending the day going around in circles, which for me is entirely second nature, so I'm delighted to be here. Murray Sinclair, who, as you know, has been the chairman of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in Canada, used a wonderful expression which I've mercilessly borrowed from time to time, and I will again today, and that is that the truth will set you free, but first of all, it will really piss you off. And I think both of what Margaret and Karin have been talking about is really a reflection of that. Yes, of course, we are all in the current of history, and we cannot understand where we are unless we have some appreciation of where we have all come from. But don't believe for a moment that history is a source of unity. History can also be abused and misused. It can be taken selectively to justify our own version, our own narrative of what has happened to us or to our people. And it can be used in such a way as to continue a conflict rather than to resolve it. And if you take something as simple as looking at the different textbooks that are used in Quebec and Ontario to talk about the history of our country, you would very quickly realize today, in 2016, school starting in September, that kids in Quebec and Ontario are going to be learning very, very different versions of where they come from and who they are and what they have been through. And so, you know, we can't avoid it, and the reason we have to keep talking about it is in order to try and find something called the truth. And can we find a history that allows us to become better, to become freer from it? James Joyce used the wonderful expression that history is a nightmare from which we are trying to awaken. Because like many, Joyce grew up in the intensity of Irish nationalism and himself was in a way a victim of Irish nationalism at the same time as he was so clearly expressing what is it remains unique in Irish culture and in Irish history. But he spent most of his life as an exile because he found it so oppressive to be caught up in the middle of that culture, underneath that culture. And so the conundrum which I think we're all wrestling with whether it's in describing the worlds that Karin has described, or in Margaret's, I hesitate to say magnum opus because she has so many more books to come. But when you look at 1919, it really is an eye-opener for anybody who reads that book, because it's a wonderful way of helping us to understand, oh yeah, I get it. Like these two guys sat down in a restaurant and kind of wrote on a map, on a napkin, what the map of the Middle East was going to look like. It was called the Sykes-Picot Agreement, and here we are. We're wrestling now and fighting over boundaries and borders, which were a product of happenstance and circumstance as much as of any kind of deliberate planning. So to bring it home to Canada just at the end, we have been going through as a country a very necessary process of understanding really who we are as a country. Where do we fit in? Our history is the history of contact. It's a history of people who have been here for thousands of years, and then it's a history of the contact that was made when European settlers came to the Americas. It was a brutal contact. It was, if you look at hockey, it was hard contact. People died in the millions across the Americas. And it's only more recently that we have begun to recognize that this is who we are in history. For the longest time, we thought of ourselves as a British nation. And then in the 50s and 60s, in response to the intensity of Quebec nationalism, we said, okay, we are actually the story of two peoples coming together to form a country. And so a whole new narrative was created to describe this country. But all the while, there have been people saying, not so much. You're forgetting something. You're forgetting the history of who we really are, which is the story of this contact between civilizations, peoples, languages, cultures, which has been violent, brutal, difficult, painful, and which we are now studying. Royal Commission, after just last week, another Royal Commission to deal with this question of who are we and what have we been doing to each other. And finally, how do we get to a better place, which is where I want to close. Go back to Joyce's comment. In some ways, we're trying to awaken from our past. We need to appreciate our past, but we also need to try to live beyond it and live through it and over it, so that not simply we can say, get over it, put it behind you, but so we can say, what can we learn from where we have been, and how can we apply it to a better approach and a better way of doing things as we go forward? It's a complicated question. We can't get out of this bubble called history, but it is something that nevertheless we have to try to figure out, how do we actually learn from it and do things better as we go forward? Thank you so much.
Bob, I think, as you can all hear, we have a great deal to talk about and only a little under an hour left to do it in. So I'll throw the first question. It actually comes from what you were saying near the end of that, Bob, and it's a rather large question. But there has been a sense, and maybe it's different now because the world somehow seems to be falling apart in many ways now, but there has been a sense for a long time that history has come to an end, that well, liberal Western society has suddenly figured it all out, and now we can just sort of relax and enjoy the profits. And I use that word intentionally. We are at the peak. We're the apogee of something called civilization, and it has all brought us to this state. And now we can look at the past as something that was a teaching tool, taught us what not to do. But now we've learned all those lessons, and we are the product of some kind of colossal, universal effort to make things perfect in the world. And that, I don't think, Margaret, that's certainly not the kind of role that you would see an historian playing. And I know that, Karin, you don't see the world from having seen the world, you know that that's not been the trajectory that we're all on. But what I'm guessing is a question that you were posing, Bob, and how do we get beyond that? How do we find the place or the way, the means to move beyond the belief that we're all just perfect?
Well,
and this is a question for
well,
all
in my
three.
case, that's not very difficult. I'm reminded of it every day, wherever I go in Canada, certainly. Seriously, Gandhi was once said to have been asked, "What do you think of Western civilization?" And he said, "I think it would be a good idea." And I think the first thing we really do quite profoundly have to learn is some degree of humility, because there have been lots of moments and lots of civilizations, if you like, which thought they were the apogee. I mean, we're not the first ones to have said, well, this is it. How does it get any better than this? I mean, the Greeks thought that, the Egyptians thought that, the Romans thought that, the Chinese, over many cyclical centuries and changing dynasties, have felt, well, this is as good as it's going to get. But I guess just to bring Shakespeare in for a moment, I mean, a friend of mine yesterday said that his English teacher in university said that the key to understanding Shakespeare is that it's all about order and disorder. And having seen Macbeth last night, I certainly had a profound sense of disorder and attempts to bring order. How do we bring some degree of order out of this chaos? I think, in fact, we made a huge, there was a huge intellectual error made when people felt with the collapse of communism that the battle between communism and capitalism was over, and capitalism was all there is. So there's nothing else. There is no other history. Well, that's just nonsense from every perspective, because there are so many other issues that are critical, A. And B, the question of how do you run an effective economy is certainly not over. I mean, capitalist economies are struggling now with growing inequality, with how do you create jobs and work and opportunity. And there are no easy answers to this. So I think we really do have to learn humility, and we do have to understand. I think history gives us one simple appreciation, and you give you this other example. If you look at 17th century Europe and think about that, imagine it for a moment. Imagine the level of chaos, the level of malevolence, if you like, the level of deep religious conflict. People who called themselves Christians having a totally different sense of what that meant, and also having a very profound sense that whatever it meant, each side was right. Each side was absolutely convinced that theirs was the only way to salvation and the only way to any kind of good life and right life. And if you didn't agree with them, then you would be tortured, killed, maimed, beheaded, crucified, burnt at the stake, and brutalized. And that was pretty much a conflict that lasted for several decades, centuries even, in terms of how it lingered on. Look at the 20th century. Probably the most violent century in history, if you look at the number of people's killed. So what do we learn from this? First, most profound thing we learn is humility. And the second thing is that the key lesson in life is, how do you live with other people who think very, very differently from you? And how do you coexist with people who think very, very differently from you? And it's made more difficult when the people who live very, very differently from you are trying to kill you. And how do you overcome that without becoming just like them? And I don't think these dilemmas have changed over time. I think they've remained with us. But the notion somehow that history ends at a point is a terrible illusion, because, as I said, we're not the only generation that's been plagued with this idea. There are a great many others that have been, but I think we have to learn how to overcome that.
Margaret?
Well, I'd like to remind you, Paul, about a bit of recent history when you said, as we were sitting outside, "Don't worry, I'll ask you an easy question."
Never trust a journalist.
No. And historians remember. Anyway, I'm very glad that Bob got first crack at it, because I agree with so much of what you say. I do think, of course, history doesn't end. History is always accumulating. We're always creating it. We're always making new histories, and we're thinking about history always, I think, in different ways. I do think, I like the word you mentioned, humility, because I think what a sense of history can do is remind us that there were people in the past who held things very strongly. I'm thinking back to Macbeth, which I also saw last night. There were people who believed in witches, believed in their capacity to tell the future and to influence human events. And we should remember...
We call those people pollsters, Margaret.
Sorry? I missed it. What? And we believe in things very strongly today, which I think 20 years now, 30 years now, a century from now, people look back and say, how could they have believed that? How could so many people have believed that a man with a funny hairstyle could be president of the United States? Or how could so many people believe that unrestrained free markets would bring solutions to all sorts of problems? I mean, history reminds us that deeply held beliefs can often be deeply wrong, and they can often be held by very clever, very powerful people who have sources of all sorts of information, and they still get it wrong. And I think that sense of humility is useful. I think what history can also do is open up a sense of possibilities, remind us that there are different ways of doing things, there are alternative paths, different ways of organizing societies. And I think we can look, I mean, history is not going to give us a blueprint for the future. It will never do that. But what history can do is just open our minds to possibilities. And when we feel despairing, as I think many of us do as we look at the world of the present, I think we need also to remember that there are a great many examples in history of peoples with different views, different religious beliefs, different languages, different ethnicities living together quite happily. Sometimes there were strains, as there are strains in any society, but I think if you look at Andalus in Spain, where Jews, Christians, and Muslims were able to coexist. The Balkans, for centuries, Jews, Christians, and Muslims not only coexisted, they lived with each other, they worked with each other. The Ottoman Empire, as a whole, was a place where different religions managed to get along with each other. And so I think we need to remember that. I mean, when people say, oh, that's just human nature, we will always be at odds with each other, or when people say the Balkans will always be like that, they always were, it's not true. And I do think we have to take some hope out of history and some humility. That's, I think, what history can do for us.
Karin.
I think we've done some amazing things in evolving our way of thinking, as you're saying. I mean, people say it's always been that way, it always will. Well, no, we've got a lot better at it. And it's one of those, cynical journalist things. I never thought I would hear myself saying it. We do it better than most places, in terms of accommodating people of different stripes, be they religious, be they ethnic, or whatever. I mean, you look at what's happening regarding immigration in Europe at the moment, and the difficulty countries are having accepting people who've had no tradition of this. Talking to Danes particularly, a refugee council saying, no, well, we have always been a very insular country and we do not know other people who come in. And you go to Poland, you never see anyone with a skin that is other than absolutely pale. We've got fairly good at it. And then there's always, the question that we continue to grapple with, how you amalgamate different values, how you determine what values are so fundamental that you must insist upon them. And that's an ongoing question with which we have to grapple, and we continue to grapple. But, we evolve. No, of course it's not the end of history. What a silly book that was. But I was talking to, a poor...
Very bright guy who wrote it, though.
Yeah, indeed, but it didn't turn out too well.
But he's changed his mind. History has forced him to change his mind.
Exactly.
Yeah, but talking to a poor beleaguered geographer at UBC, and I didn't realize there's a book been written now called The End of Geography. He was really very happy because he was referring to a globalized world where everything happens the same way in many places, and thus geographic differences don't make any difference. And he was feeling that he got the last laugh on that one. So not only the end of history, you can do the end of geography next year.
Okay, I want to remind people to try to get the attention of an usher if you want to write a question that will be fielded up to me on the stage eventually. I'm conscious of being on a stage in which this year at the Stratford Festival, history is being presented. In fact, it's a sort of accordion ism of the great Shakespeare plays that we're dealing with English history. Bob mentioned Macbeth, and Margaret saw it last night as well. It's a history play. And my question, I guess, is what about the form that the history comes to us in? I mean, we can talk about bad books by smart people, or we can talk about boring books by not very interesting people who are writing the nitty-gritty, the nuts and bolts, the facts and data of what was in the past. And or you get an absolutely amazing, brilliant writer like William Shakespeare writing history. I put it in quotation marks, but he's doing history too. And he maybe has a different kind of power when he's presenting national myths or presenting ancient history, Antony and Cleopatra, going back to the Greeks and the Romans for stuff. What happens when somebody who doesn't claim to be an historian starts writing history and does it perhaps in a more powerful fashion than most academic historians would have the opportunity to do? Margaret.
Well, I think what Shakespeare does so wonderfully, he read history. As much as we know about what he read Hakluyt, and he read what other histories were available at the time. And I think he then used it in an act of imagination to create his plays. What I think he put at the center of his plays was the human beings, their interaction, their nature, constrained as they often were by the worlds in which they lived. He wasn't writing history, he wasn't setting out to write history, but he was bringing in history. And I'm for anything that awakens people to a sense of history. I think historical novelists do a wonderful job often. I mean, Hilary Mantel has made people interested in Thomas Cromwell in that period, in Henry VIII. And you hope that they will then go on and read it. The sort of writing I don't like is that which draws on history and just gets it completely wrong. And there are bad historical novels, or there are bad histories as well, which put thoughts into people's minds. As an historian, you can't have someone thinking something unless you have evidence that they were thinking it. So you can't think that, Marie Antoinette sighed one day, as I once read in what was meant to be history, and thought, oh, I do hope people have enough to eat. We don't know she was thinking that. We don't know unless we have evidence.
We probably know she didn't think that.
Yeah, we probably
right?
know she didn't. Well, we always need to have evidence. And so I do think history has to be well written. You can't make it up. You can't create it. And there's anything that gets people interested in history. But again, you get good movies and bad. I still remember there was a wonderful one made years ago about the Crusades with Tony Curtis as Richard the Lionheart, which was a bit improbable anyway. And Richard the Lionheart had a sister, not there in history, but a sister with a very large bosom, who was a Hollywood starlet. And she was kidnapped by Saladin, which Saladin did exist, we know, and they fell in love. It's a big Hollywood scene on a balcony, and then she said, no, I must go back to my people. She went back to Richard, and he said, oh, good, I'm glad you're back. Now I can start fighting again. And she turned to him, and the mortal lines in the movie was, Dick Plantagenet, war, 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 that is all you ever think about.
Well, if I heard Donald Trump, dare I say that name, once again, talking about how America made a huge mistake when it gave Canada its independence. And it's really dangerous when you have people walking around with these absolutely crazy ideas in their head, which are based on complete nonsense. And so, this is what makes it so important for us to realize that the process of learning never stops. I mean, in the case of Mr. Trump's case, it obviously will never stop because it
hasn't started.
It hasn't started yet, but it's about time somebody, kind of just took them through it, really slowly with pictures, maybe PowerPoints, some way of getting it done. But
Pop-up books might do.
But it is. Just one thing is, I think that what is great about what's happened with historical writing in the last 25 years is that we have rediscovered, and Margaret's had a lot to do with this, and others have as well, but we've rediscovered the importance of narrative, of telling stories, of telling the story. because academic history can become completely specialized and very much a silo that is very hard for the non-professional historian to penetrate and to understand. And in the academy itself, there's this tremendous prejudice and bias against popularization, against saying, well, you're getting something out there. And I think it's really important that happen, and that there also be a continuing debate and dialogue about, well, is that true or is that good? And clearly now with the media revolution that we're living through, the method and means of communication today are so completely different. I always ask my students at the University of Toronto when I'm first classes, I say, where do you get your information from? Where do you get your facts from? How many of you read a newspaper? The answer last year was no one. Yeah. Wow. No one. Not a single person read a newspaper on a regular basis. So you're getting your news from information, you're getting your history from Twitter or from a social media site or from a website. And the tendency of websites actually is not to bring people together. Yeah. The tendency of websites is that if you're from a particular perspective, you will go to the website that you feel is friendliest to your point of view and reinforces what you think. And globally speaking, the internet has not brought people together. The internet has not had the effect of turning us into a real global village in that sense.
What was going through my mind was that what has happened is a much more immediate and complete, to the point of being overwhelming, recording of fact. So the recording and the live streaming of the police shooting by the girlfriend of the young man puts it out there in an absolutely undeniable way, which makes it much harder to hide. And that adds to things, I think. You know, that's not, it won't become history until tomorrow. But is that a positive thing? Can't help but think it leads to more accuracy.
Yeah, sure, because, I mean, it's the equivalent of you know, Margaret, the kind of historical work you do, which is going through documents and going through letters and going through into the archives and really understanding what the background, what the communication is, so things that people said is perhaps a little different than what they actually did in terms of how things worked through. Now we're getting it in the instant 24/7 response, which, you know, doesn't necessarily lead to civility.
No. And it doesn't necessarily mean we know what people are thinking who are making decisions, because more and more people are reluctant to put down in any way their reasoning because of things like WikiLeaks. You know, governments are becoming very, very cautious about what they write down, what they keep. Diplomats have now become a lot more cautious. When your emails can be accessed through freedom of information, you become more cautious. I mean, historians are really worried about what the record is going to be in the future.
Yeah, you know, the BBM messages are a little less easy to track than writing a telegram or correspondence. Yeah.
And, you know, a lot of it will disappear. You know, tweets disappear. You know, they don't.
Oh, no, they don't.
Well, not some. The ones you don't.
If you think your tweets disappear, Margaret, you've...
I don't tweet.
Well, no, but we tweet about you. You see, that's different.
Then you might disappear if you're not careful.
I already have.
I'll throw out one question which might be sort of self-flagellatory, and that is, it used to be said that journalists were doing the spade work for historians, that journalists were looking around and taking the tone of society, measuring what's actually going on, and that's the kind of thing historians would go back to and turn into narrative history or something. Now, Bob, you said your students aren't even reading newspapers, so I'm not sure whether journalists have any role, but I'm curious and sometimes quite worried about what journalism does, not to history, but to the present. And that is, it makes it black and white, it makes it extreme, it makes it sound as though the world is falling apart. And those aren't necessarily the kinds of questions or attitudes that a historian would bring to the same material. And so I'm throwing out the question is, like, to what extent is a lack of comprehension of history to be blamed on people like me and you, Karin, who are trying to tell the story as they see it on the ground.
Well, better that they should still be out there slugging away trying to write some things down than not at all, which is also happening as numbers of journalists are diminishing, etc. And what you get now is citizen journalism, which is unmediated and unregulated in any way. That's a problem. And you also, of course, get everybody playing into journalistic moments, opportunity. I mean, there was a Médecins Sans Frontières camp in Sierra Leone where all the amputees were treated, and that became the photo opportunity spot when Madeleine Albright came by to give money, and when everybody else came by to give money, that was the spot, you know, and that was media and leaders feeding upon each other, you know. So I don't know, are journalists the raw material for narrative?
I think they often are. I mean, I always look at newspapers when I'm writing something because you get the day-to-day things. I mean, not that journalists at the time could know everything because there was often things happening that they couldn't. But what worries me is what you said. I mean, you're a vanishing species. And newspapers are closing down foreign bureaus because they can't afford them. Networks are closing down their foreign bureaus. And you need someone there on the ground who has been thinking about the issue. You can't just fly someone in and expect them to understand another society, another culture, another politics overnight. And that deep knowledge, I think, which you get from diplomats as well, you can get from academics if only they would share it. And I agree with Bob, we don't do enough about sharing what we know. But I think it's very important to have people who've been looking, you know, you can't understand Canada unless you've been living and working here and thinking about it for a great many years. You can't just fly in and suddenly get a sense of Canada. And I think the same thing is true of any part of the world. And that's where I really worry about what's happening to journalism, because I think we're losing that capacity for reflection and good editorial control. And I'm not sure we're gaining something from you know, the citizen journalism, but I'm not sure we're gaining that reflection that we need.
No, I agree with you there.
No, but I think that's a real problem. And I think if you take let's take, for example, I've referred to it before, but the American election, I mean, it would be so helpful if there were more reflection in any fashion, not only on television, but through any form of communication, on, you know, have we been through this before? Has America been through a period of populism and anger and nativism and protectionism in the past? How have we dealt with it before? To give citizens a chance to really reflect on what's happening before they cast their ballot. Because the tendency today is for everything to be very impulsive and emotional, and for people to respond very quickly. You have your BlackBerry on you, or your whatever, and your iPhone, and you're just immediately responding to the event. It's a very immediate response. And if you look follow, for example, I dare say, you may think I'm crazy, but if you follow the Twitter account of Donald Trump, you realize how completely, not repulsive, but impulsive it all is, how just totally reactive it is. And then if you have a sense of, well, we've actually been through these waves before in the 19th century, in the 20th century, in American political culture, we've been through this. And most recently we went through it with McCarthy. And you say to yourself, here we go again. But if there was only more of a sense in what the journalists and the media and others were doing in reminding Americans to say, this is what we're going through, this is what we're experiencing.
But isn't that part of what's haunting Hillary Clinton at the moment? We've been through this establishment, gridlocked Washington time and time again. We want to get away from it.
Yeah, but that message is a repetitive message. I mean, the conflict between populism, nativism, whatever you want to call it, and liberal democracy is an ongoing challenge. I'm only saying that there is a need to encourage reflection, and frankly, to encourage people to slow down, because the speed with which everybody's being asked to respond today is contrary to any notion of wisdom as to, well, how are you supposed to reflect on this and decide? I mean, speaking very personally in politics, you go up to a microphone and you're expected to have an instant answer in a scrum to whatever is thrown at you. And you're supposed to be able to say, well, here's my answer, instead of saying, you know what, that's a good question. I actually don't know the answer. Yeah. Try saying that 3 times in a scrum and see how you look. That's why I'm here today. I'm very, very, very relaxed.
I'll throw one more question that has to do with something you all mentioned in your initial presentations. This is a difficult question, I think. I would like to hear all of you reflect on what the connection is between truth and reconciliation. Bob.
Well, thanks very much. Well, I think the reconciliation is actually the harder part. And I think we confuse the process of truth with the process of reconciliation. Paul, you will recall Portnoy's complaint, because everybody of our age read that when we were a certain age. And of course, the last line in the book is the therapist saying, "Okay, so okay, and now we're ready to begin the therapy." I think that's true for the reconciliation process as well. I think that we go through the agony of people in the process of truth and reconciliation on the residential schools, people describing their experiences, describing sexual abuse, describing being taken away from their parents, describing the whole horrendous process which the majority culture inflicted on First Nations over the space of 145 years. And we think that by listening to that, we've somehow achieved a process of reconciliation. And often people talk about, the fact that, well, now that you know where a body is buried or how somebody died, now you have closure. And to me, this is just like, what kind of fantasy world are you living in? This is just the beginning of a process of coming to deal with this historical process. And so it is really important, I think, for us to reflect on the fact that as Canadians, and actually Murray Sinclair talks about this very openly. He says, look, this was a 6 or 7 generation experience. It's going to take many generations to get through it, and it's going to be agonizing. And we're going through this as a country now. The only thing we can hope is that most Canadians who feel themselves to be relatively unaffected by these issues will spend at least some time in their life trying to understand why this is such a big deal for their fellow residents of this part of North America, and really appreciate the degree of anger and hurt and frustration that is still being experienced in this generation and will be for future generations. It's very hard. And I think it's, Margaret talks about how historians can be the difficult people in the room. And I think a number of us have to be the difficult people in the room to say, well, you might think this is over now, and you might think that, well, these issues are being resolved and I don't have to worry about it. But actually, it's not being resolved. It's still with us today. And because the majority culture is so big, numerically, and the First Nations people are such a relatively tiny minority in our country, people often think they can just ignore it. In South Africa, the Truth and Reconciliation process was very different because it was the majority culture that was able to express itself, and that has continued with this process on an ongoing basis. That's why we need these royal commissions every so often, to just kind of goad us and remind us and push us to say this is what we have to come to terms with. But in terms of the First Nations issue in Canada, this reconciliation process, it is a long-term process, and it requires change. And as any one of us who've been in any kind of relationship will know, change is difficult. You have to learn how to stop making mistakes and how to learn how to do things better. But you can't claim to have learned something unless you have a capacity for change. If you say, oh, I've learned it, I've got it, and you haven't changed, you haven't learned anything.
No.
And I think that's a truth that's true for individuals, but it's also true for us as a country.
No. No.
Karin, you must have specific stories of people who have either benefited or not from having the truth revealed.
Well, and I was two things I'm thinking of, and one is out of South Africa, and that was the tremendous hunger to appear before the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, part of which I think came from the fact that it was Desmond Tutu, that you had a phenomenal human being leading this process. And there was a township attached to the town of Winchester, north of the Cape, where there was a group of people who were years afterwards just beside themselves because there was no time for them. They couldn't tell how she had been electrocuted, and there was no time for them. So, and the other one, in Guatemala, Guatemala had a Truth and Reconciliation Commission. They did, put a lot of stuff out there. A Canadian corporation was the only corporation cited for wrongdoing in that document. I just figured that's worth reminding people. That was INCO for allowing planes to fly off their property during hostilities. So it was all done, right? Truth and Reconciliation is done. Everybody's fine. The women there were a group of women bringing a lawsuit against the current Canadian owner of the mine there for actions the Guatemalan subsidiary did against them. It was rape, seizure, all sorts of stuff. And the Canadian court has actually accepted jurisdiction. It's the first time that's ever happened, which is quite phenomenal. So when the women came down from the hill, it was a 3-hour trek to hear that the suit here had been launched. One of them brought with, Rosa Elvira was her name, brought with her a broken bowl. It was an ordinary eating bowl, just as furious about the fact that this bowl that would have cost $2 was broken. And we were to take it back to Guatemala City to give it to an archivist. The archivist was putting together a scholarly exhibition at a university of artifacts documenting the history of atrocities in that country. It was the kind of thing you should be able to do after the Truth and Reconciliation had reported. And we took it back, and he said, he was a very demure man, but very demure, very proper. It didn't radiate bravery for a minute. He had reported on the excavation of the mass graves, and that's what had got him going. He said, as far as this bowl was concerned, his female relative, and he wouldn't say sister or cousin or aunt, his female relative was afraid that if he put this together, this exhibition, she would be raped. That it would come back at her, that there was no reconciliation. It just hadn't happened. And there's a certain amount of going through the motions. I mean, perhaps well-intentioned, but it takes a long time to get this stuff right, even when we're well-intentioned and, start to think. We get impatient, but do actually start to think, my daughter might be better at treating a First Nations person in this country as just another person who sits in the desk next to them than perhaps I was or my mother was, So it's hard. Yes, it's hard. And as I said, we do it better than other people, although we haven't got it right yet.
Margaret.
I don't think I have much to add. I think both of you are very eloquent and very right. I mean, it's a fact of being human, isn't it? We keep on trying. We don't always get it right. I think what is very important, I mean, you both talked about process, but what is very important too is that there should be a strong framework within which the process can take place. You need laws, you need agreements of how to behave, you need civility on both sides, you need a willingness to listen. And I went to something in Helsinki fairly recently. A new group is being organized called Historians Without Borders, which I think is, well, part of its purpose is to try and break through some of these nationalist myths which divide people up. But one of the sessions was a session between Armenian and Turkish historians, and they ended up shouting at each other. And all the nice Finns said, oh dear, we didn't think this would happen. But it is a process. But I mean, and you cannot expect an easy fix. I think you both put it so well. So thank you.
I'm starting a similar organization called Lawyers Without Clients.
Can I join? can I just throw one more thing in? You know, just periodically I'm struck by historic issues we sort of pretend didn't happen, or they're so big you can't possibly come to terms with them. I mean, you know, the journalists kind of look for anniversaries periodically, and I went, oh, this is the 50th anniversary of the founding of the Black Panthers. And you go, wow. Founded in Oakland in October of 1966. And you sort of go, well, I guess there's probably a link between the Black Panthers historically and Black Lives Matter today. Mm-hmm. And we haven't somehow dealt with that one. You know, is it because it's too immediate? Because it's too uncomfortable? I don't know, you know.
Well, another example that I find quite fascinating is the growing awareness and discussion in Germany about those people who lived in what is now Poland and in other parts of Eastern Europe for hundreds of years, like not just for 10, 15, 20 years and so on, lived there through, and it was part of that's where that was their geography, that was their home. And when the Second World War ended, of course, there was a massive redrawing of boundaries and massive displacement of people and people coming back into what is now Germany, and it's like a kind of amputation. People are suddenly realizing that they can only bury this memory for so long, and now they have to start to talk about it. Yeah. And it becomes a real issue as to how do you deal with that level of historical memory that has actually been suppressed because people have been actively told, get on with your lives, move ahead, don't think about it, just get on with it. And it's now is it politically incorrect? Is it what is it? You know, how does one discuss those things?
Yeah, yeah. And they have to be discussed,
yeah.
I think.
Big question from the audience. Actually, two big questions. Do you feel there has been any change to patriarchy over history, and will there be? Margaret.
Well, there have been changes to both patriarchy and matriarchy. I mean, let's not forget the matriarchs, who also have their place in history. But yes, societies change. I think societies, by and large, in the past were patriarchal, although there were many that were matriarchal. And I think even in patriarchal societies, and I think this is what women historians are discovering, women were not entirely without influence and status, and perhaps not formal influence, not formal position, but often had tremendous influence. I mean, in the great age of exploration and trade, in Amsterdam, for example, the merchant families, the women played a very important part in maintaining the family while the husbands were away traveling. They often looked after the finances. They often were partners in the business. And so I think we need to remember that women played often a greater role than sometimes the formal record would give them credit for. But I think we've seen in our own time a significant shift in the relationships between men and women entering parts of society, entering occupations, which would have been unthinkable, I think, a generation or so ago, or at least very difficult a generation or so ago, and now it's perfectly normal. So things change all the time, I think, and I think we have seen a significant shift.
Maybe, in fact, that is the lesson we should take from history, that, as Bob said, things have to change or can change, otherwise we are frozen in some sort of state.
I think we're very rarely frozen in time. Things are often changing. I mean, we used to think of the Middle Ages as the Dark Ages, with things not changing, and again, historians have seen huge amounts of change occurring, differences occurring within the Middle Ages, different parts of Europe experiencing different things. I think we have to be very careful of imposing a particular view on the past. You know, it was all this in the past, now it's all different in the present. And there are many different things happening in the past and many different pasts.
Another big question from the audience, actually it's a two-parter as well. Is there now a clash of civilizations? And if so, what is it?
I think Bob should answer that.
Yes, I'm all for patriarchy on difficult questions.
Well, just not to avoid that question, but just to say, I mean, I think in my own life, political life, I think I'd have to say the biggest changes we've seen in terms of human rights, the environmental revolution, the women's revolution, and the great transformation which has taken place with respect to lesbian and gay and transgender rights in our own country, and not only in terms of the formal legal system, but in terms of public attitudes and differences in celebration and recognition, it's been transformative. And so if you say to me, you know, things don't change, I said, not at all, things don't change. Things do change. And in fact, it's the possibility of change that, and the way things change, that actually you learn from history. You learn how quickly opinion can change. You learn how quickly things can look differently and be seen differently. And I think that's a huge lesson to keep reminding yourself of. So history is not about there being no possibilities or it's just one damn thing after another. It's about understanding the possibilities of transformation. To get to your question, I think there's no question there's a clash about something. Whether it's a clash of civilizations, I think that's a bit simplistic. Because I think that we need to understand and appreciate that it is not a clash between Western civilization, if you like, and Islamic civilization. That's not what it is. Because, as Margaret pointed out earlier, Islamic civilization has many, many different elements and connotations and historical expressions that we need to understand that there have been, whether it's in Spain or in the Middle East or in the Ottoman Empire or Islam in Indonesia versus Islam somewhere else. There's a lot of variety, and we should not assume that it's all one thing. I do, however, believe that we are facing a conflict between societies that are proud to call themselves open and peoples who see themselves as living in a closed universe in which their ideas are correct and everyone else's ideas are wrong. And I think we have to deal with the expression of violence, extremism, and the degree to which people are prepared to use those techniques to get their way in the world. I just think we have to be very, very careful and thoughtful about how we deal with this, because it isn't, as someone once said to me, it isn't possible to be smart and angry at the same time. And I think the level of violence that we see in society makes a great many people very angry, but you really have to be smart about what is the best and most effective way to overcome it. I think we have to recognize that in the last 25 years, if you look at our policy towards Iraq and other countries in our efforts to deal with so-called extremism, we have used just about every wrong technique imaginable with impacts that are, I think, have been very negative. So we have to really continue to engage and use that word again, reflect on what's going to succeed as we try to allow for societies to become more open and more diverse and provide greater opportunity for their citizens. Not because this is a Western idea, but because I guess I do associate the idea of being human with the idea of being able to express yourself and the idea of being able to be yourself. And if there are regimes in place which prevent people from expressing themselves and being themselves, I think those regimes are closed and repressive. And it's hard to see how they can be sustained or be a model that should be exported around the world. So, yeah, there is a clash, but I think we have to be careful how we describe it.
I'm sadly conscious of the time, and I think we only have about 5 more minutes. There's a question.
You better not ask me the next question then.
Actually, this is a question which asks everyone to put their historian's hat on when looking at current events. And so Margaret will get the last answer here. I'll throw it to either Karin or Bob first. Please comment briefly on Brexit.
Oh dear.
Do you want?
Well, certainly the sense is that most people Well, obviously not. I was about to say most people are sorry it happened, but obviously not. The majority of people voted in favour of it, of Britain leaving the European community. I suppose now we will see if, how Theresa May gets on with it, and what can be made of it. I don't quite know what else to say at this point. At least that's short.
Bob.
I think the vote was a mistake. I think, again, to go back to open and closed, I think if you're more open, you're aware that it would have been better for Britain to have stayed in and tried to effect some of the changes. I don't think the European Union was perfect. I think there's lots of problems with it. But I think that leaving has given way to a much more closed and smaller sense of opportunity for the UK than, and it will create other problems. But as Yogi Berra said, it ain't over till it's over. So I don't think Brexit has really happened yet. We've had one vote. Let's just see what happens, because I think there's lots of possibilities of other things happening. So don't declare the result until we know what it is, and it ain't over yet.
No, I thought it was a dreadful decision, and I've sort of said so. And I got very annoyed during the campaign. There was a sort of version of history being peddled when the Leave people were saying, we'll go back to that glorious age, the Elizabethan age, when we were this and this. And I said, you were a little island afraid of being invaded with a hostile kingdom of Scotland to the north. Do you really want to go back to that? Well, if you do, you'll have to take up privateering again. You'll be paying the bills by pinching other people's ships. And there was a lot of talk. Canada was held up as a model. Usually Canada was some sort of mythical country which people talked about without knowing the first thing about it. And they said, we'll be like Canada. We'll negotiate all these trade agreements easily.
Right.
Well, I remember,
With Donald Trump.
With Donald Trump, yeah. And it was absurd. But what worries me so much, I think Britain is turning in, but a lot of the vote was anti-immigrant. It was not about the European Union at all. It was about immigrants, and often in areas which didn't have many immigrants. But immigrants have become shorthand for everything they didn't like about what was happening. But what worries me is not just what it will do to Britain, which may well end up being smaller. Scotland, quite rightly, in my view, would be right to decide to separate from this rather inward-looking anti-immigrant country. But what worries me is also what's going to happen to Europe. This is not a time when you want to see Europe falling to pieces. It's got Putin on one side. It's got tremendous internal problems. There's a rise of populist right-wing parties. Everybody took the European Union for granted. Everyone took NATO for granted. Everyone took the long peace for granted. Remember Europe's history. It really worries me. Sorry, I meant to end on an upbeat note, but...
I honestly believe that I do have the best job in the world, but the worst part of my job, the one really bad part of my job, is actually having to call closure on conversations like this, and unfortunately the clock is my enemy here, and I have to do that. There were obviously many more questions from the audience that I didn't get a chance to include. You can perhaps join the line in the lobby. Bob and Margaret will be autographing books. Karen's
I haven't
actually
finished mine yet.
Yeah. but she'll sign your questions. And that'll happen immediately after this. In fact, we'll be urging you not to sort of stay on and around in here to talk to the panelists. Go out there because they have to get this stage set for a presentation this afternoon. Other than that, I'm supposed to advertise a couple upcoming events in the forum, and I'll break my arm patting myself on the back by saying you could come along on Wednesday, if you'd like, to a forum event called Newfoundland Preserves, in which Gillian Kiley will be discussing the Newfoundland accent, which she uses to some effect in As You Like It, not a place set in Newfoundland, although she's put it there. She'll be discussing that with an actor from Britain who's very much into contemporary pronunciations of Shakespeare, into doing Shakespeare, reading Shakespeare the way Shakespeare apparently was read. And the example that I get from the World Wide Web is that when Hamlet says, to sleep, He doesn't say that. He says, to sleep, perchance to dream. And it does change the way a play is read. And that's Wednesday. That'll be in the Studio Theatre. And then again, next Saturday, I'll be back with another Ideas Forum. And that will be a forum talking about the challenge of peace with next year's Massey lecturer. So I invite you to come along for those. And I want you to join me now in thanking Margaret MacMillan, Bob Ray, and Karin.